Every disaster begins before anyone realizes it has already started. They didn't rise because they thought they would win. They rose because living without fighting had become impossible. In the summer of 1944, in Warsaw, tens of thousands of people went to war, knowing the odds were stacked against them. Not soldiers with tanks, not an army with air support, but students, workers, teenagers, doctors with pistols, homemade grenades, and almost no ammunition. They weren't trying to defeat Germany. They were trying to prove something far more dangerous, that Poland still belonged to the Polish people. For 63 days, the city fought alone. No rescue, no real reinforcements. Just hope, slowly bleeding out as the streets turned into rubble. By the end, Warsaw wasn't just defeated. It was erased. 200,000 civilians were dead. The city was burned, block by block, and the people who survived were forced to leave the ruins of their own capital. This wasn't a story of victory. It was a story of defiance and of a courage that had no chance of success but refused to stay silent. The plan was simple and almost suicidal. When the Germans started pulling back, Warsaw would rise. The city would be liberated by its own people before anyone else could claim it. The uprising was led by the Home Army, a massive underground force that had survived 5 years of occupation. On paper, they had tens of thousands of fighters. In reality, only a fraction had weapons. One rifle for several men, a few bullets per fighter. Some units went into battle, knowing they could fire only once. Still, on August 1st at 5 p.m., the city exploded. Barricades went up in minutes. German patrols were ambushed. Flags appeared on rooftops. For the first time in years, Warsaw felt free. Not safe, not secure, but free. That moment mattered, because everyone understood it wouldn't last. The Germans reacted fast and brutally. Elite units were brought in, heavy artillery, tanks, flamethrowers. Entire neighborhoods were punished for resisting. Civilians were executed in the streets. Hospitals were bombed. Anyone suspected of helping the fighters was killed on the spot. And still, the city kept fighting. Messengers, often teenagers, ran through sewer tunnels under constant fire. Makeshift hospitals operated in basements with no anesthesia. People cooked soup from whatever could be found in ruined buildings. This wasn't a battlefield anymore. It was a city refusing to disappear. And all the while, just across the river, another army was watching. Waiting. Across the river stood the Red Army. Close enough to hear the fighting. Close enough to see the smoke rising over the city. But they didn't cross. Days passed. Then weeks. Inside Warsaw, the situation collapsed faster than anyone had planned for. Food ran out first, then medicine, then water. People drank from fire hoses, from polluted wells, from puddles collected after rain. German air raids became routine. Every morning meant guessing which building would be gone by nightfall. Entire streets vanished in hours. The fighters adapted because they had no choice. They turned furniture into barricades, Molotov cocktails into anti-tank weapons, sewer tunnels into supply lines. Those tunnels became lifelines, dark, flooded, barely breathable. People crawled through them for hours, carrying messages, weapons, the wounded. Many never came back. The Germans didn't just want to defeat the uprising, they wanted to break the city itself. Special units were ordered to clear districts completely, not capture them, erase them. Civilians were driven out of basements and shot in courtyards. Entire apartment blocks were burned with people still inside. Children, elderly, the wounded. This wasn't chaos, it was systematic. And still, resistance continued. Because surrender didn't mean survival. It meant execution, deportation, or camps. For many, fighting was the only remaining form of control. Radio broadcasts kept going even as the city collapsed. Short messages, defiant, almost calm. Warsaw is fighting. Warsaw is still fighting. Outside the city, Allied planes attempted supply drops. Most of the crates fell into German-held areas. Some landed in the river. A few reached the fighters, never enough to change the balance. By September, the uprising was no longer about victory. It was about time. about holding on one more day, one more street, one more building, not because it would change the outcome, but because stopping meant admitting that everything had been for nothing. And Warsaw refused to admit that. By late August, the illusion of rescue was gone. Everyone in the city understood it, even if no one said it out loud. No major offensive was coming, no breakthrough, no last-minute intervention. Across the river, orders were being written and rewritten, delays explained as logistics, silence framed as strategy. And one man had the final word, Joseph Stalin. A non-communist Polish resistance liberating its own capital was not a victory he wanted. So Warsaw kept bleeding, politically inconvenient, militarily expendable. Inside the city, that knowledge spread slowly. Through rumors, through absence. Fighters waited for sounds that never came. Engines, artillery, anything. Instead, they heard German loudspeakers, promises of mercy, threats of annihilation, lists of districts marked for destruction. Every day followed the same pattern. Morning bombardment, midday fires, night assaults. Sleep became impossible. People rested in minutes, not hours. Always dressed, always ready to run. Children learned the sound of different weapons, mortars, machine guns, flamethrowers. They learned which walls were safe, which stairwells collapsed first, how to stay silent while hiding in rubble. The uprising created its own world, sealed off, shrinking, brutal. A city inside ruins, a society under siege. Courts were improvised in basements, orders typed on salvaged machines, newspapers printed on scraps of paper. Culture didn't stop. Poetry was written. Songs were sung quietly to avoid detection. Plays were performed underground for audiences who might not survive the week. Because if life was going to end, it wouldn't end in silence. As September dragged on, entire districts fell. One by one, when an area was lost, it wasn't retaken. There were no reserves, no second line. Every retreat meant fewer fighters. Every loss was permanent. Wounded soldiers faced impossible choices. Stay and slow the others down, or be left behind. Some asked for weapons, others asked for poison. Doctors ran out of morphine weeks earlier. Amputations were done with alcohol and prayer. Screams were muffled with cloth and hands. The Germans called it pacification. What it really meant was erasure. Buildings were wired with explosives after being cleared. Streets disappeared overnight. Landmarks that had stood for centuries were turned into dust. By the time October approached, Warsaw was no longer a city in revolt. It was a graveyard still resisting, and the people who kept fighting knew exactly what was coming. They weren't blind. They weren't naive. They stayed because leaving meant the story would end differently, because surrender would rewrite everything they had tried to prove. So they held on, not for victory, not for survival, but because someone had to remember that Warsaw did not fall quietly. By the last weeks, the uprising had lost its shape. There were no clear fronts anymore, no continuous lines of defense, just isolated pockets of resistance, cut off from each other by ruins and fire. Orders became suggestions. Plans turned into instincts. People fought where they stood, a stairwell, a basement, a single room with one remaining window. Commanders knew the numbers. They counted bullets instead of fighters, minutes instead of days. Every decision now carried the same weight. Who gets to live a little longer? Some units dissolved quietly, not out of cowardice, but because there was nothing left to hold. Others refused to move at all. They swore to defend one building, one block, one intersection, even if it made no strategic sense, because strategy no longer mattered, meaning did. Civilians moved like shadows. Whole families lived underground for weeks without daylight. Children stopped asking questions. They understood answers would only make things worse. People marked walls with chalk, names, dates, last messages, not for rescue, for memory. German troops advanced slowly now, cautiously. They knew desperation made the defenders unpredictable. A man with nothing left to lose was more dangerous than one who still hoped. Booby traps appeared everywhere. Doors, staircases, collapsed floors. Each step forward cost time, and time was the one thing the Germans were willing to spend. Negotiations began quietly, not about victory, about how the end would look. Inside the city, reactions were mixed, relief for some, rage for others. To stop fighting felt like betrayal, to continue felt like suicide. But by then, the city had already paid the price, whether the last shots were fired or not. Entire districts were empty, not destroyed, empty. The people were gone, deported, executed, disappeared. Those still alive could feel the city slipping away from them, not falling, being taken apart piece by piece. And still, small acts of resistance continued. A sniper firing a final shot, a flag raised on a shattered wall, a broadcast sent into the void, knowing no one might answer. Not to change the outcome, just to say, we were here. The uprising was no longer fighting history. It was writing it, line by line, body by body, street by street. And Warsaw kept standing, not as a city, but as an idea that refused to surrender. When the formal surrender finally came, it didn't feel like an ending. It felt like exhaustion becoming official. The remaining fighters laid down their weapons, not in defeat, but in recognition of reality. They had done everything that could be done with what they had. There was nothing left to prove with bullets. The agreement promised prisoner of war status. For some, that meant survival. For others, it meant years in camps, or never coming back. Civilians were ordered out of the city. Columns of people moved through the ruins carrying whatever they could still hold. Suitcases, bundles of clothes, family photographs wrapped in rags. They walked past streets that no longer had names, past houses that were only outlines in dust, past places where entire lives had existed just weeks earlier. After they left, the real destruction began. German units systematically demolished what remained, not in the chaos of battle, but calmly, deliberately. Explosives were placed building by building, libraries, churches, schools, hospitals. It was an operation, not a punishment. The goal was simple. Warsaw was not meant to exist anymore. By January 1945, when new troops finally entered the empty city, over 80% of it was destroyed. What they found wasn't a liberated capital. It was silence. No uprising, no civilians, no resistance, just ruins and the memory of those who had refused to disappear quietly. The people who survived carried the uprising with them, not as a victory story, as a wound. They remembered the days when the city breathed freedom for the first time in years, and the weeks when it suffocated under fire. They remembered choices that had no good outcomes. Decisions made knowing the cost would be unbearable. And they remembered that, for a brief moment, Warsaw had belonged only to itself, not to occupiers, not to future rulers, not to history books, just to the people who stood up, even when standing meant falling. After the war, the fighting stopped, but the silence didn't mean peace. For years, Warsaw's ruins stood as they were, not rebuilt, not explained. Just there, broken, empty, uncomfortable. The people who returned didn't come back to a city. They came back to absence. Streets ended abruptly. Maps no longer matched reality. Entire neighborhoods existed only in memory. And with the new order came a new problem. This story didn't fit. An uprising led by non-communist resistance. A city that rose on its own terms. A battle fought without permission and without approval. So it was pushed aside. Official narratives changed. Commemorations were limited or discouraged. Some names were erased again, this time from records, not buildings. Those who had fought learned quickly what could be said out loud, and what was better left inside. The uprising became something private, a story told at kitchen tables, in whispers, in fragments. Parents didn't always tell their children everything, not because they forgot, but because remembering out loud could be dangerous. Graves were unmarked, heroes unnamed, survivors treated with suspicion. The city was rebuilt, but not restored. New buildings rose where old ones had been deliberately erased. Different streets, different monuments, different meanings. And yet the past refused to disappear. Every year at the same hour, the city paused. Sirens, stillness, a collective memory breaking through decades of enforced quiet. Because even when history is buried, it doesn't stay buried forever. For the people who had lived through it, the uprising was never about strategy or geopolitics. It was about the moment when fear stopped working, when obedience lost its grip, when survival alone was no longer enough. They remembered the feeling of standing upright again, even as everything collapsed around them. They remembered the cost of that choice, the faces that never came back, the streets that ceased to exist. And they remembered something harder to explain, that knowing you will lose does not make resistance meaningless. It makes it honest. Warsaw didn't rise because victory was possible. It rose because surrender had already happened once, and that was unbearable. That truth survived the rubble, survived censorship, survived decades of silence. It lived in scars, in pauses during conversations, in the way people looked at the city, not as stone and concrete, but as something earned, something paid for. And even now, long after the smoke cleared, the question still hangs over the ruins that no longer exist. What do you do when fighting will destroy you, and not fighting will destroy who you are? For many who lived through it, the hardest part came later. Not the bombs, not the hunger, not even the fear. It was being told, quietly, consistently, that what they had done was inconvenient, that the uprising was miscalculated, unnecessary, premature, that it complicated alliances, that it didn't fit the narrative of liberation. For the people who had watched their city burn, those words landed like another defeat, because they hadn't risen for applause. They hadn't risen for approval. They had risen because occupation had stripped life down to obedience, and obedience felt worse than death. That part was never negotiable. Survivors carried the memory in ordinary ways, in how they flinched at loud noises, in how they counted food even when there was plenty, in how they avoided talking about certain streets that no longer existed. Some refused to speak about it at all, not out of shame, but because words felt too small. Others talked endlessly, repeating the same details, afraid that if they stopped, the story would vanish for good. The uprising didn't end cleanly, it didn't resolve, it didn't teach a clear lesson. It left contradictions, courage mixed with catastrophe, honor tangled with loss, a moment of freedom followed by decades of control. That made it dangerous. Because history prefers clarity, but Warsaw offered none. It offered a question instead, one that never settled. Is resistance still meaningful when defeat is guaranteed? Does dignity justify destruction? Where is the line between heroism and tragedy? The people who fought didn't pretend to have answers. They weren't philosophers. They were exhausted human beings pushed past the point where survival alone was enough. They chose action over waiting, even knowing how it would end. And that choice refused to disappear. It surfaced in later generations, in how the city remembered time, in how it marked loss, in how it reacted to power and control. Warsaw learned what it meant to be abandoned, and what it meant to stand anyway. Not because someone would come, but because no one did. That knowledge became part of the city's DNA. Not loud, not triumphant, just there, uncomfortable, unresolved, impossible to erase. What makes the Warsaw Uprising difficult to digest, especially from a distance, is that it refuses to be simplified. It doesn't fit into the usual categories. Not a clear victory, not a clean failure, not a lesson you can wrap up in a sentence and move on from. For outsiders, it's tempting to ask why. Why rise with so little chance? Why sacrifice a city? Why not wait? But for those inside Warsaw in 1944, waiting was not neutral. Waiting meant watching others decide the future of your country. Again. Waiting meant accepting that survival was the highest value left. And that felt like another form of defeat. Occupation had already taught people what patience looked like. It looked like mass executions, forced labor, deportations, disappearing neighbors. So when the moment came, imperfect and dangerous as it was, many chose to act, not because it was smart, but because it was theirs. The uprising wasn't driven by optimism. It was driven by exhaustion. 5 years of terror had stripped away the illusion that there was a safe option. There was only choice and consequence. Inside the resistance, doubts were everywhere. Arguments, warnings, fear. This wasn't blind enthusiasm. Many knew the odds. Some openly said it would end in disaster. But once the first shots were fired, hesitation became irrelevant. History doesn't pause once it's in motion, and so the city committed itself, fully. What followed wasn't just physical destruction, it was moral overload. How do you justify asking civilians to endure this? How do you live knowing your decision may have doomed thousands? How do you stop once stopping changes? Nothing. Those questions haunted survivors far longer than the fighting itself. Some never forgave the leadership. Some never forgave themselves. Some refused to forgive anyone at all. And yet, even among the harshest critics, one thing remained difficult to deny. The uprising changed how Warsaw saw itself. Before, it was a city under occupation. After, it was a city that had stood up and paid the price. That mattered, even if it couldn't be measured in territory or treaties. Because nations are not built only on victories. They are built on lines people refuse to cross, even when crossing would be easier. Warsaw crossed one line in 1944. It refused to accept that survival without agency was enough. That refusal didn't save the city. It didn't save most of the people who fought. But it left something behind, something stubborn and dangerous, a memory that power alone could not erase. A reminder that control is never complete, that even crushed resistance leaves traces. And those traces don't disappear when the ruins are cleared. They linger. Those traces lingered in ways that were easy to miss, not in speeches, not in official ceremonies, but in habits, in instincts. Warsaw learned to distrust silence. Because silence had once meant abandonment. It learned that promises from afar could evaporate overnight, that help might be visible and still never arrive, that being almost saved was not the same as being saved. This shaped how people thought about power. Authority was no longer assumed to be protective. Allies were no longer assumed to be reliable. History was no longer assumed to be fair. The uprising stripped away those illusions permanently. For those who had fought, the memory was not heroic in the cinematic sense. There were no clean moments, no clear turning points, no satisfying arcs. Just exhaustion layered on top of fear. Fear layered on top of responsibility. Responsibility was the heaviest part, because every decision had consequences measured in lives, not abstract lives, known faces, neighbors, friends, family. People remembered exactly where they were when a building collapsed, when a message never arrived, when a street went silent. Those moments became fixed points in time. Everything else blurred. Years later, survivors could still draw the old city from memory, street by street, corner by corner, even when those places no longer existed physically. They remembered where they ran, where they hid, where they lost someone. The rebuilt city never fully replaced the old one in their minds. It sat on top of it, like a second skin. For the next generation, the uprising was inherited indirectly, through pauses in conversation, through photographs with missing names, through sudden changes in tone when August came. Every year, at the same moment, the city stopped. Cars halted. People stood still. Sirens cut through the air. For 1 minute, everything froze, not as a celebration, as recognition. Because the uprising was never just about 1944. It was about what happens when a population is pushed to the edge and decides that even a doomed stand is better than silent acceptance. That idea doesn't age. It doesn't stay in the past. It waits. It waits in cities that feel cornered, in people told to be patient one time too many. In moments when calculation collapses under the weight of dignity. Warsaw learned that once such a line is crossed, there is no clean way back. You don't return to who you were before. You carry the choice with you, always. And the city carried it quietly. Not as a slogan, not as a myth, as a warning written into its bones. That warning was never spoken out loud. It didn't need to be. It lived in the way people reacted when power demanded obedience, in the hesitation before trusting grand promises, in the instinct to look for exits, physical and moral, when authority closed in. Warsaw understood something early that others learn late, that being on the right side of history offers no protection in the present. In 1944, the city was technically on the side of the Allies. It was fighting the enemy everyone agreed was evil, and still it was left alone. That contradiction stayed. It taught a brutal lesson that moral alignment does not guarantee survival, and courage does not obligate anyone to help you. For many survivors, this knowledge reshaped how they saw the world. Good and evil became less abstract, more personal, more fragile. They stopped believing in inevitability, because nothing about Warsaw's fate felt inevitable while it was happening, only irreversible after. People often ask whether the uprising was worth it. It's an easy question to ask decades later, from safety. But inside the city, the question didn't exist in that form. The real question was simpler and harsher. How much of yourself are you willing to lose in order to stay alive? For some, the answer was, not everything, not this time. That decision wasn't unanimous. It never is. And it shouldn't be romanticized. The uprising tore families apart, created guilt that never healed, left scars that no monument could explain. Some lived long lives haunted by a single choice. Others died convinced they had made the only one they could live with. Both realities existed at the same time. That's why the Warsaw Uprising resists closure. It refuses to become a clean parable. It sits in the uncomfortable space between bravery and catastrophe, between agency and annihilation, between meaning and loss. And maybe that's why it still matters. Not because it offers answers, but because it exposes the cost of asking the wrong questions. Warsaw didn't ask whether it would win. It asked whether it could still recognize itself if it didn't act. The city answered that question with fire, rubble, and silence. And then it lived with the answer. Living with that answer meant learning how to carry contradiction, to honor the dead without pretending their deaths were necessary, to respect the fighters without turning them into symbols that no longer felt human, to remember the uprising without smoothing its edges. That balance was never stable. Some wanted the story told loudly, as proof that resistance itself had value. Others wanted quiet, because noise felt like betrayal of the suffering. Both impulses came from the same place. Because when loss is this total, memory becomes fragile. Too much pride turns it into propaganda. Too much doubt turns it into shame. Warsaw walked between those extremes for decades. The uprising remained present even when it wasn't mentioned. In architecture that avoided grandeur. In memorials that felt restrained, almost hesitant. In a city that never quite trusted permanence. Buildings went up quickly, but attachment came slowly. People learned that stone could vanish, that homes could be temporary, that cities, like lives, were not guaranteed to finish their stories. This changed how Warsaw related to time. The past wasn't sealed off. It pressed forward, constantly, into decisions, into fears, into how people imagined the future. Every political shift reopened old questions. Every crisis echoed earlier moments of abandonment or resistance. Every call for patience carried a shadow. Because patience had once meant waiting while the city burned. That didn't make people reckless. It made them alert. Warsaw didn't glorify collapse. It understood it. It understood how quickly normal life could be stripped down to essentials: food, water, shelter, choice. And it understood how quickly choice could disappear. That awareness lived beneath everyday routines, subtle, persistent. You could see it in how people reacted to control, in how quickly skepticism surfaced, in how seriously freedom was treated, not as an abstract value, but as something that could vanish overnight. The uprising taught that freedom doesn't announce when it's leaving. It erodes quietly, piece by piece, until one day resistance feels impossible, unless you act before certainty arrives. Warsaw acted without certainty, and paid the price. That didn't make the lesson simple. It made it heavy, because the city knew something most histories prefer to avoid, that sometimes there are only bad options, and choosing one doesn't make it good. It just makes it yours. That weight didn't fade with time. It settled. It became part of how the city measured risk and responsibility, because Warsaw knew what happens when decisions are postponed until all the facts are clear. In 1944, clarity never arrived. Only momentum did. The uprising taught that history often moves before permission is granted, before consensus forms, before outcomes are known, and once it moves, it doesn't wait for comfort. This made later generations uneasy with easy answers, with slogans, with certainty spoken too confidently, because certainty had once come from people who promised order and delivered ruin. Warsaw learned to live with unresolved questions, not because it liked them, but because resolving them too neatly felt dishonest. The city understood that courage could coexist with catastrophe. That intention didn't cancel consequence. That meaning didn't undo damage. Those ideas were not academic. They were learned through loss, through empty chairs at family tables, through anniversaries marked by absence rather than celebration, through streets that existed twice, once in memory, once in reality. The uprising also changed how the city viewed heroism. Heroes weren't flawless. They weren't always right. They were people who acted while afraid and lived or died with what followed. That version of heroism was harder to sell. It didn't fit posters. It didn't fit speeches. But it lasted because it matched experience. Warsaw never fully embraced the comfort of distance from its own past. It resisted turning the uprising into something that belonged safely back then. Instead, it allowed the discomfort to remain active, as a reminder that extreme situations do not produce pure outcomes. They produce choices made under pressure, and pressure distorts everything. The city remembered how quickly moral clarity collapses when survival is at stake, how fast ideals become fragile when people are hungry, exhausted, surrounded. That knowledge didn't weaken Warsaw. It hardened it, quietly, not into defiance for its own sake, but into awareness. Awareness that freedom is not a permanent condition, that resistance is not always loud, and that waiting for the perfect moment can be its own form of surrender. Warsaw never claimed the uprising saved it. It claimed something more modest and more dangerous, that when the moment came, the city chose to speak in its own voice, even knowing the voice might be silenced, and that choice, once made, could not be undone, only carried forward. Carrying it forward meant accepting that some wounds don't close. They just stop bleeding. Warsaw never tried to heal the uprising away. It learned to live around it, like a city built around a scar, not hiding it, not touching it too often, but never pretending it isn't there. This shaped how people understood loss. Loss wasn't treated as failure. It was treated as consequence, and consequence demanded respect, not denial. That's why the uprising was never reduced to numbers inside the city itself. 200,000 dead was not a statistic. It was an echo of voices that had filled stairwells, of hands that had passed ammunition, of names called out once and never answered. For many, memory became an obligation, not to glorify, not to justify, but to refuse forgetting. Forgetting felt too close to surrender, and surrender had already taken enough. Warsaw understood something else as well, that outsiders would always try to simplify what happened, to turn it into a lesson, a warning, a mistake, a symbol. Each version stripped something away. Because the uprising was not one thing, it was thousands of individual decisions collapsing into one catastrophe. Some fought because they believed help was coming. Some fought because they believed nothing was coming. Some fought because stopping felt worse than dying. All of them were right, and all of them paid. That complexity is uncomfortable, especially for people who want history to behave. Warsaw never demanded agreement about the uprising. It demanded honesty, honesty about abandonment, about miscalculation, about courage that didn't save lives, about lives that gave meaning to courage. The city learned that memory doesn't have to console. Sometimes its job is to disturb, to keep questions open, to prevent the past from being sealed off and declared resolved. Because once a society believes it has fully understood its own tragedy, it stops listening to the warning inside it. Warsaw kept listening. It listened in moments of pressure, in moments of fear, in moments when silence would have been easier. The uprising had taught the city what silence can cost. So even decades later, when the streets were full again, when buildings stood where rubble once lay, when life looked ordinary from the outside, something remained alert beneath the surface. A memory that refused to become comfortable. A knowledge passed down not as pride, but as gravity. And gravity doesn't shout. It pulls. That pull shaped how Warsaw responded to moments of pressure long after the war ended. When authority demanded silence, the city remembered what silence had once cost. When compromise was presented as the only rational option, Warsaw remembered how rational decisions had once erased it from the map. This didn't make the city reckless. It made it cautious in a different way. Cautious about trusting systems that promised stability in exchange for obedience. Cautious about narratives that reduced people to pieces on a board. Cautious about being told that suffering now would prevent suffering later. Because that argument had already been tested and failed. The uprising also changed how Warsaw understood responsibility. Responsibility was no longer just about protecting life at all costs. It was about protecting meaning, even when the cost was unbearable. That distinction is difficult to explain to anyone who hasn't lived under occupation. From the outside, it can sound abstract. From the inside, it was painfully concrete. Meaning was the difference between living as a subject and existing as an object, between choosing and being moved, between acting and waiting to be acted upon. The uprising was the moment when waiting stopped being tolerable, and once that threshold was crossed, there was no neutral ground left. People sometimes imagine resistance as a single decision, a clear moment, a raised fist. In Warsaw, it was a slow accumulation, small humiliations, small losses, small compromises that added up until nothing recognizable remained. By 1944, many felt they were already living in ruins. The physical destruction just caught up later. That's why the uprising felt inevitable to those inside it, even as it looked reckless from the outside. It wasn't about winning a war. It was about refusing to let the end be written entirely by others. That refusal didn't save the city, but it preserved something harder to quantify. A line that could be crossed, and once crossed, could not be erased by force alone. Warsaw learned that power can destroy structures faster than it can destroy meaning. That control can be imposed, but legitimacy cannot. Those lessons didn't expire with the rubble. They lingered in how people evaluated leaders, in how they responded to fear-based arguments, in how quickly skepticism surfaced when obedience was framed as virtue. The uprising left the city with a permanent sensitivity to moments when history accelerates, when events move faster than debate, when waiting feels safer until it isn't. Warsaw knew what happens when you wait too long. It had lived through it, and that knowledge never fully relaxed. And that is why the Warsaw Uprising still refuses to sit quietly in the past, because it wasn't a misunderstanding, it wasn't madness, and it wasn't a romantic gesture made in ignorance. It was a decision made with open eyes, in a moment when every available option carried disaster. The people who rose in Warsaw understood something most histories soften with time, that sometimes history does not offer a path that leads out alive. Sometimes it only offers a choice about how you go. They chose not to disappear silently. That choice did not spare the city. It did not protect civilians. It did not force allies to act. What it did was expose the brutal limits of morality in wartime, the point where courage stops being rewarded and starts being punished. Warsaw became the place where those limits were crossed, and never uncrossed. It showed what happens when resistance meets abandonment, when bravery collides with geopolitics, when a city fights for its future while the future is being decided elsewhere. This is why the uprising still unsettles people, why it provokes arguments instead of consensus, why it refuses to become a clean lesson, because it forces an uncomfortable question, not about Poland, not about 1944, but about human dignity itself. What does dignity mean when it guarantees nothing? When it saves no one? When it only ensures that the end will hurt more? Warsaw answered that question once, and the answer was devastating. The Warsaw Uprising did not save the city. It did not change the course of the war. It did not bring help when help was closest. What it did was leave behind a line that says there are moments when survival is not the highest value. When obedience costs more than resistance, when losing with dignity feels less unbearable than living without it. Warsaw crossed that line, knowing exactly what it would cost. That doesn't make the uprising a victory, and it doesn't make it a mistake you can dismiss. It makes it a warning, because one day, somewhere else, someone will face the same choice, with the same lack of good options. And when that moment comes, Warsaw will still be there, quietly asking, "What do you do when there are no chances left? But there is still a choice?"